Okay, as we go into the second section associated with the heart, what we're primarily going to be focusing on is the heart's beat. In other words, how does the heart beat? And the first thing you want to recognize is that the heart has what's known as an intrinsic conduction system. Okay, the cells of the heart, and this was discussed briefly in the video related to birth and fetal development, but the heart cells end up beating completely on their own. They start beating, in fact, I believe it was before the nervous system was even truly developed. So this intrinsic system is what allows the heart to beat in the first place. Now we have special, what is known as autorhythmic tissue, and this is what's known as the SA node or the sinoatrial node. This is the pacemaker. The SA node is what primarily determines the rate of the heart beat. Then we have what's known as the atrioventricular node, the atrioventricular bundle, bundle branches, Purkinje fibers. Notice that by the name you can actually kind of figure out where this is located. So the atrioventricular, so we're going to be around that area of the atria and the ventricles. Same here, the atrioventricular bundles. So you kind of have an idea of where we're going. What's very cool about this too is this is sequential by definition. In other words, we have to see a pattern or a sequence of contraction in order for the heart to pump blood. Keep in mind that we've talked already about the fact that the atria need to contract simultaneously, then the ventricles. We don't see one part of the heart contract and then another part. We don't have four heartbeats. We have a lub-dub type idea. Now, the cardiac cycle results in atria contraction simultaneously. Then when the atria are relaxing, we have the ventricles contract. Systole is contraction, diastole is relaxation. This is key right here. Okay, typically as one is relaxed, the other is contracting. So if the atria are contracting, that means the ventricles must be relaxing. So systole is contraction. When the atria has systole, the ventricles have diastole. Now, how this sequential order occurs is based on the location of the sinoatrial node. So notice that my sinoatrial node is right up here at the top, okay, of my right atria. Notice how we send the signal to the right and left atria. In essence, kind of a simultaneous idea. As the cells, the muscle cells, are depolarized, just like we talked about with skeletal muscle, we have a shortening of the fibers here in the cardiac muscle. Remember that cardiac muscle has striations just like skeletal muscle. And so as that fiber comes through here, as that signal comes through, one of the things you want to look at is notice this little piece right here. See this right here? That is the atrioventricular bundle. So we have the signal from the SA node that travels through the atria, all the muscles. Well, as it's traveling through, it also then gets to the AV bundle. Now what's cool is after it's hit the AV bundle, so in other words, our signal, our depolarization wave travels to the AV bundle, or the AV node, I'm sorry. The AV node then travels through the AV bundle. Okay, the AV bundle is this area here. So here's my AV node. I have the AV bundle traveling down through the septum. Okay, as it travels down through the septum, keep in mind that we then have the bundle branches and the Purkinje fibers, and that's all of this here. As it travels down, it's going to come up the walls of the ventricles, and we see then the depolarization wave hit these muscles, and then the ventricles contract. So again, keep in mind, when the atria relax, the ventricles are contracted, vice versa, systole and diastole, and it is this controlled contraction of both the atria and ventricles simultaneously that allows blood to flow into and out of the heart, to basically be pumped by the heart. Now, one last note linking back to that form and function theme that we've been dealing with the whole time is notice the difference in the size of the ventricle muscularity, the wall of the ventricle on the left and the right. What's so significant about that? Well, keep in mind where the blood is going. The blood from the right ventricle over here is going to the lungs. So this is heading to the lungs. That's a really ugly lung, but it's going to the lungs. The blood from the left side is going out the aorta, okay, to the body. So what do you suppose we need more pressure? To get the blood through the body or to get the blood to the lungs? Well, it makes more sense that we need a lot more pressure getting the blood into the body, and so you see that obvious difference here in the wall of the heart, the wall of the ventricle. Okay, so now moving on, quick reminder again, we have left and right atria going simultaneously, we have ventricles going simultaneously, and this is what allows the blood to flow. Notice in the diagram, and this is figure 11.6 in your book, notice from the diagram that we see the location of the blood during the different parts of the cycle, and that's huge. Keep in mind also that we hear what we commonly refer, well, that was bad, we commonly refer to as the lub-dub. Okay, can you hear muscle contract? No, that goes without saying. So when we hear the lub-dub, the question is really, what are we hearing? Because we know that applies to our heartbeat. What you're hearing is you're hearing the opening and closing of the valves between the ventricle and the atria, and the opening and closing of the semilunar valves to the pulmonary and aortic arteries. Now, when we talk about the cardiac cycle, and we're talking about what's going on in one complete heartbeat, again, this is simply putting into words what you saw here in the diagram. We have a cycle of, again, we have a sequential occurrence of events that helps the blood to flow around the body. Keep in mind that you have to be able to track a single blood cell from the right atria all the way through the heart, all the way through the body, and back to the right atria. Well, this is what's going on just within the heart. Now, when we talk about cardiac output, or the amount of blood that we are moving around the body, it depends on a couple of things. It's going to depend on the stroke volume, okay, and so this is the amount of blood that we move by a single ventricular contraction, and it's going to change the, it impacts the cardiac output. In other words, what's going to affect the stroke volume is literally the amount of blood that's in the heart. In other words, what we care about here is what's known as venous return. The amount of blood that is returned to the heart by venous return is impacted by muscular contractions. In other words, muscle contraction is what helps to push blood up through the venous system and back into the right atrium of the heart. Well, as you start exercising, you have a lot more muscular contractions. It's going to send a lot more blood back to the heart. We see a stretching of the heart in response to that amount of blood. This increases our stroke volume, and that's going to increase our overall cardiac output. This is, of course, obviously important when we are dealing with exercise. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is how we ultimately control the heartbeat. Even though the heart is autorhythmic or self-regulating to some extent, there are certain situations where we can modify neurally, generally speaking, the amount of, or the speed of the heartbeat. Okay? And again, this figure just kind of highlights some of those key points. The main thing that you want to pick up on here is where we have the promoters, in other words, what's going to increase it, and then the reducers, what's going to decrease it. Notice that the parasympathetic can reduce the heart rate, okay? Notice the impact of venous return on stroke volume, especially if it's a decreasing venous return. This is a reducing effect, which means that if I increase the venous return, it increases. It's a enhancing effect. So it just goes through some of the various things that you need to look at. Now, regulation is going to be affected by hormones, exercise, blood volume, blood pressure. We have parasympathetic control because, again, the heartbeat should be relatively straightforward during times of rest. And then, of course, with the presence of adrenaline, we increase the heart rate, and that was associated with the ease, the exercise, the excitation, the embarrassment, etc. Now, getting back to our autorhythmic idea, we already talked a little bit about this. We talked about the electrocardiogram, or the QRS wave. Keep in mind what's going on in terms of activity with contraction and relaxation with each wave. So we see different points where we have systole and diastole. The QRS segment is what's associated with our ventricular systole. In other words, we see the ventricles contracting. Notice how similar this looks to an action potential, which we have seen with skeletal muscle and the nervous system. And, you know, this just ties right into everything else we've talked about. What you would need to be able to do, or what I would like you to be able to do, is to take this information and link it up with what's actually going on in terms of our activity with ventricular contraction, atrial contraction, the lub-dub sound that we associate with the opening and closing of the valves, etc.